All right. So I want to start by thanking you both for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to tell us more about this work and about your work in the field. Can I get you to start by introducing yourselves and the work that you do?
We agree on who goes first.
Yeah. Who wants to volunteer?
All right, I'll go first. So my name is Josephine Walwema. My friends call me Josie. And I came to TechCom sort of in a roundabout way. I thought I would just mention that I was born and raised in Uganda, which had been colonized by the British. Sorry, it was a British protectorate, not a colony. And so we inherited their system of education. And at the time, so you finish O levels, and then you do A levels, and then you go to college, and you study traditional things like English, literature, or social work, or law. And so I had never heard of Rhetorical TechCom until years later when I had gotten married and moved out of Uganda. I was living in Botswana, and I had a friend who got a job it was a North American company, but it was based in South Africa. And they said they were hired as technical writers. I was like, what is that? And, so I began to investigate it and found that, my English major, because I had always been an English major, could be a pathway to TechCom. So I took a short, long distance course with the Carleton University. And then after that, I was like, I think I like it enough to get a higher degree in it. So then I came to the US and studied TechCom. And here we are. So that's how I found out about TechCom. Is there another aspect of that question? Yeah.
So I'm Jimmy Butts, and Josie and I met in graduate school.
That's right.
So we went and got our PhDs both at Clemson University in the Rhetorics, Communication, and Information Design program there. And now I'm the director of the writing program at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I like teaching writing. I like funky, strange writing. During grad school, I worked in a laboratory during the day while I was getting my master's, and got my English master's in the evenings. And so in the day I was testing concrete and cement stuff, and I could do that job because I could read and write and do research, then later at Clemson, I did some technical writing as a job on the side in the same kind of area, grout and tile and stuff like that. But I always liked science. I started out as a biology major in undergrad, and I was good at it. But in the end, I decided to follow my passion in English and writing. And so thinking about scientific or technical language rhetorically has always been sort of interesting to me, especially when we find interestingness in what might otherwise seem like a bland or boring space, So that's sort of where I am.
Yeah, I was going to say, I always find it so interesting how many folks wind up in this area, like kind of late or by accident. They discover it so late in their careers. Like I'd heard of technical editing before I even thought about grad school. I worked at a quilting magazine and we had tech editors. But I'd never heard of it as a field of study until I was in my PhD. Yeah, but you actually gave us that perfect segue across, Jimmy, into that next question around thinking about fun. So one of the big concerns that came up from multiple students when we read your work was that term hedonism. And they felt kind of a bit unsure about using that word, about its connotations and subtext. And they felt a lot comfier saying things like fun. And I've got a quote here from one of the students. He wrote that the word hedonism has both positive and negative connotations, but maybe leans more to the negative in that it indicates excess or decadence. Can you tell us a bit more about why that term? Why hedonism? What's like the pros and cons of choosing that term?
Yeah. So, synonym was Josie and I talked about, synonyms are not just synonyms, and with like any word choice, what are the stakes with word choice? Just basic word choice. And so why hedonism, there's the one thing, like, why not? Lex Runciman in his article on fun says, why not fun? And so why or why not hedonism instead of just calling it fun? And that was a consideration for the article at one point. We considered pushing more towards that term fun. But hedonism has a long philosophical history, and some of that we trace in the article. Fun is really a newer term and a concept, and fun is important, and they're related in teaching and learning and writing. But also, as the question suggests, there's this sort of transgressive quality to hedonism, and we felt like technical writing could benefit from some of that transgression and a little bit of that radical resistance that can happen. And I think it can sometimes come across, the negative connotation, there can sometimes be pushback against, that's too hedonistic for me, right, in a rhetorical sense. And then, but it can also be really affective. And then also, as Josie and I were thinking about this question, I just read Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress with some students last week. And in that book, she talks about transgression and fun can both offer quite a lot, especially if a community collectively brings that to the table together, that the resistance can be productive. And so that's some of that history there.
Yeah, I don't know if I can add much more, but like I think one of the biggest consideration was, we had to trace sort of the progression of the word of the instantiation of hedonism, whereas fun is not something that maybe has a big scholarly tradition, right? So, in fact, initially the article was very heavily philosophical, and so it went through some revisions, and that's why we toned it down somewhat in order to fit it into TechCom journals. So it's a good question, but that's how we ended up with it. Well, started with it and then ended up in its current iteration.
I shove a question in there. You spoke about the revision history of this work. Can you talk about the process of getting this published? Because it is in many ways a challenge. It's a challenge to the field, right? In both criticizing those new ideas and asking folks to move forward and think differently. Can you tell us how that went for you as junior scholars?
I remember one of the reviewers' comments that I remember was, "You guys think you're so what? You guys think you're so funny or something? You guys think?"
There were reviewers that had, said, you can't say this about TechCom because you're undermining the field that you're supposed to be supporting, and that's true, except that what we had to do better in revisions was acknowledge that there is quite a lot of fun happening. There's a lot of really interesting, playful stuff going on, and we tried to integrate that more. and not just recently, but we went back and found some older examples as well. But revision history, it was hard. And, so I originally gave this as a paper at ATTW. Must have been, I don't know, I was trying to think of the year, Josie, but it was like 2017 something, or something.
Probably even earlier.
And so it took years, really, for this article to finally come out. We went through revisions, and life happened, and and we got a few rejections, and we took that feedback and went back to the table and worked on it. And it's the first article that I co-authored. Josie co-authors more than I do. But that process of working back and forth was really rich for me. And but going back and forth with the different journals and trying to find the right place for it took time.
Right. And trying to, I was just reminded of the Kenna Ichuyachuk published this article where she observed that reviewers have a lot of power over what gets published and what doesn't. So some of the things you end up with is, are you just pleasing the reviewers, or are you like maintaining your argument as you wanted it to be? So we did encounter some of that, and the challenges that Jimmy had just mentioned. It was just so hard to, not hard, but difficult to reconcile some of the reviewer feedback with actual instances of TechCom. And so we decided to add the angle of delivery as a mechanism, as the point of in the moment where you share this technical information, and how you either get attention, get and hold attention, and then deliver the technical information. And I don't know whether that helped, but it forced us to read quite widely and to, yeah.
Well, I guess the question of changing the habits of technical writing and of the field of technical communication, the question is written as like, how difficult do you think it will be to change those deeply rooted habits? And I think we get quite a bit of the answer in that discussion, right? So maybe the second part of this, do you think that the field has become more open to this recently?
I'll start because as we indicated in the article, technical writing has been defined by two characteristics: technology and the workplace, right? So based on these characteristics, and maybe based on what the reviewers were resisting, is that technical communication helps, should be centered around technology and the workplace, right? And so what we were doing was outside of those bounds. And so it was difficult for reviewers to take what we're saying maybe seriously, or to at least be open to what we were saying, what we were arguing. However, there is technical communication taking place in private, non-formal workplaces. We know that. And so I felt like, I think she's Lauren Durack, wrote this great article about gender and technical communication and what kinds of things were deemed technical, and what wasn't. That's why women were left out of TechCom, right? And of course, we have Miller and Rude helping us map out the research questions for technical communication. As a result of those changes, right, we've seen an expansive outlook to technical communication. I mean, there was a time when risk wasn't a technical communication issue, or ethics, or even indeed social justice, queer studies, or plain language. So we acknowledge the difficulty for the field sort of wanting to remain conventional. However, we have seen it change in terms of the research areas. And as Rude 2009 said, a field is defined by, its field's values are defined by what it researches, etc. So that's why we think that the change might be slow, but it cannot be helped. Just the other day, yesterday, I think I saw a tweet there's a student at Penn State. His name is Gabriel Aguilar. I really like his work. And he tweeted something about humanitarianism as technical communication. I haven't read it, but it's there. And so, yeah, there's room for growth.
Yeah. I think I was thinking habits and conventions die hard, but also maybe thankfully in some sense that, habits and conventions can be useful. It's not that they aren't useful. But I was also thinking, it's an interesting question because it's essentially asking, is the world open to becoming more fun, or more hedonistic, or are we becoming more serious over time? And I think that openness is always happening or always growing, right? There's always this kind of movement in conventions and habits. But then certain stakeholders might double down on seriousness. And so it's a tension that will always kind of continue through history, maybe.
Are you channeling Richard Lanham a little bit, rhetorical?
Yeah, so I don't know if we mentioned that in the article, but Lanham mentions homo seriosus and homo rhetoricus, and that those two beings are in tension with each other. And that's going to be, it's crazy to think that that's always the case, because to think that openness can ever stop, but there must be a doubling down on the seriousness for that tension to remain, I suppose. Is the world getting more fun or more serious over time? That's the question. There's potential for more fun, I think.
Yes, I think we come down on that.
Yes, yeah, and I think probably a desire for it as well. Probably some both and happening in here.
Oh, yes, it's a both and. That's a very Richard Lanham thing. Looking through and looking at. Yeah.
Let's take a bit of a turn and go from those philosophical pictures to philosophical register, I guess, down to kind of some practical questions. So you gave the example in the article of the Air New Zealand flight safety videos, and that was one that came up in our class as well, because Australia, we love to watch the Air New Zealand flight safety videos. We're like a self-consciously non-serious sort of a place, I think. And one of the things we were talking about is that tension between how do you provide really critical information in ways that's usable while also getting people's attention. And that's exactly where your article is at. And we were comparing the videos to the seatback instructions, and thinking about whether there are ways, how you can balance those kinds of tensions between getting the point across and getting people's attention and managing their brand. So then the question coming out of that was, do we feel like there are genres that it would be completely off limits or completely inappropriate to take a hedonistic approach?
So Josie, go ahead, Josie.
So, sorry, are there genres that are outside of the bounds of hedonism? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Mm.
So Josie and I thought no, because we would resist saying anything is off limits on the one hand, because we're good postmodernists. But we also talked about, so something about like joking about death, for example, might be too taboo or hurtful, but we do that culturally in different places. And there's the dumb ways to die example from TechCom.
From here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as with anything, you want to think about the rhetorical situation, what's going to be most effective and fitting in that rhetorical situation and how it's going to hit or not.
Yeah. We thought that. I couldn't help, although of course, I think of the things, of the genres that sort of seem critical, if you will. I think everything is. Think about risk, for example. I did this article where I was looking at the city of Cape Town in South Africa and how they dealt with the water crisis. And one of the interesting things I found that the citizens were doing is that because the city had instituted a strongly advised a 2-minute shower. And so some people had creatively created a song that ran exactly 2 minutes that you could sing to yourself while in the shower. When it's over, you're out of the shower, right? That's a good way of communicating risk in a not so serious manner, but it helps you to sort of time yourself so that you're not running afoul of the city's ordinance. And you're also, because you've been heavily fined, and you're also contributing to pushing back day zero, which the city was facing. So there are, like Jimmy said, there are many instances in which, like Jimmy said, the rhetorical situation matters. And so you as a technical communicator have to make this assessment and decide when to deploy hedonism.
The other one that I always think of is teaching people to do CPR to staying alive.
Yes.
Which is like absolutely a joke, right? But perfect, right? It gets the point across. And it gets the point across because it's a joke about people dying. Like, yeah.
But
it blurs the boundaries in a really interesting and productive way, I think.
We have a question here around multimedia, the rise of multimedia and multi-platform communication. Do you think that having those multiple ways to convey a message gives technical communicators more latitude to use rhetorical hedonism?
Yeah, sure. So because Air New Zealand can also have other documents with the same information presented more seriously, then that sort of allows them or affords them the rhetorical space to play in other instances with the same information. So because you have multiple platforms, you can have funny ones and serious ones. And so it allows maybe space for play because of the different media that can contain the same information.
And you've heard of, I wonder where simulators fall, for example, in training, sort of pre-training people. They sort of, the idea of play, right? And how that sort of prepares you to do something more serious. I agree that multimedia has expanded the avenues for the ways in which you can communicate technical information in less than serious ways. I think I've had this thing with students where I tell them to render some form of technical communication into a multimedia project, and they always opt for cartoons, and they'll draw these cartoons that are sort of that are both that some of them that embody both form and content, and I think that's a good way of conveying some. It's funny that students turn to those, and also animation. They might use those animation tools, free animation. They might do that as well. So I think that there are more ways that we can convey tech comm in non-serious ways today.
Yeah. I see a lot of comics too. I was wrapping up grading yesterday. I have a blanket fort documentation project in this class. So everyone does their instructions for their blanket forts. Needed something lockdown proof. Does their instructions and then user tests and revises. And I had a whole string of comic ones this time around, which was fun. It's fun. Always fun to grade.
Yes.
All right. So this question, when I emailed it through to you, I think it maybe set your thinking, maybe prompted some follow-up. We're talking about the risks of using humor and hedonism, in that, humor is obviously culturally dependent. It's deeply contextual. What works in one place is not going to work in the other. So the question was, if we're thinking about creating communication that might not age well, or might not be culturally sensitive, might be very context specific, what are the factors that you think technical communicators need to be thinking about when they're using humor and using hedonistic approaches in technical documents?
So we talked about this aging problem. Maybe you have to think about future audiences, but all texts age, right? And so there are non-humorous texts that might talk about things that haven't aged well, or hit a future audience in a taboo way. In the same way. And so I'm wondering if joking, like we were trying to think about joking about sexuality, for example, in ways that were once done inappropriately and unethically, is different from a non-humorous text that would discuss the same things in a similar way over time, that would be received by a contemporary audience in a similar off-putting way. And so I was reading Andrea Lunsford and Lisa Eadie's Audience Addressed, Audience Invoked with some students recently. And in that article, they talk about writing for future audiences and trying to imagine them. But you can't imagine every future audience and how it might sit with them. Whatever you're writing now might sit with them. And so I was trying to think, is playfulness unique in its ethics, of treating a thing? Does humor age differently than a serious text? Maybe only in that humor is intentionally treating a thing lightly, or playing with an idea, whereas a serious text isn't treating it lightly. But that's sometimes the inherent point of the humorous text. But I think all texts age. All texts could be problematic for a future audience, or for an audience that is outside of the conversation or whatever, But we have to be careful, and think as ethically as possible in any text that we're generating, right? I think Josie had some other thoughts. on the reception problem.
Right. Well, I felt I thought about, and I hope Jimmy can actually talk about the types of humor too, because I think it's very informative in sort of giving a broader conceptual approach to this. But I was just thinking about how comedians nowadays have been discussing what counts as funny, what counts as comedy. Um, is comedy at the expense of somebody else really comedy, right? And so, is it or is it a lazy form of comedy? Because we have also, I'm sure you have people comedians in Australia who make you laugh about things that are not punching down or that are not taking advantage of other people. And we came to the conclusion that when we think critically about things, we're capable of a creativity that is inoffensive and yet effective, right? Yeah, Jimmy, I think it would be great if you talked about those types of humor.
So this didn't make it into the article, I think, but there are really three main theories about how humor works. And I teach this to students sometimes because it's a nice teachable 3-point model. There's incongruity theory, that two things that don't go together are funny because you put them together. So like a duck with a hat is funny because those two things don't normally go together. Incongruity theory. And then there's superiority theory, which works where you're laughing at somebody who's experiencing pain, like slipping on a banana peel or a pie in the face is funny because somebody else is experiencing pain and you are safe. And what some of those theorists even go as far to say is that this is the way that humans bear their fangs, by laughing at the weaker. Other animals don't necessarily laugh, they bear their fangs, and we don't bear our fangs in the same way, but there's a kind of laughing at. And then the third way that humor works, the main theory, is social anxiety theory or relief theory, that something is funny because we have a social anxiety around it and we need to deal with that psychologically. So laughing about death or sexuality might be because we have our own issues about that thing and we're trying to process those issues. And so humor is a way of catharsis to deal with those things. But it's also why, like, jocks might joke about homosexuality in the locker room, is that they are self-conscious about their sexuality. And so there's also a superiority theory, and it goes back to all these kind of theories start to overlap and intertwine in different instances. But incongruity theory, superiority theory, and that relief theory, they work pretty well. Kant actually talks about these in terms of humor. And some of those are unethical. And so you have to think about, again, rhetorical situation, think about your audience and what's going to be effective or ineffective.
Right.
Yeah. It's all our same principles that we work through every single time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So this came out like literally the week my reading list was due, and I immediately yanked something out and put it into my genre week.
You were so pleased.
I was so excited. I said this to you on Twitter, Josie, that I was like literally opened it up and then like rang someone and started performing a dramatic reading of it, because I was like, yes, I cannot. I was so excited to teach this. This course is, it's a lot of folks in our creative writing program and our publishing program. And we have that sense very commonly of technical writing, professional writing is really instrumental and practical and no nonsense is what it says on the marketing materials. And like, it's just not, I get all these teaching evaluations that say I thought this was going to be so dry, but actually it's good. So I was extremely excited to turn this around and get it in there so quickly. That's a roundabout way of saying this is an incredibly recent article. It just came out, like 3 months ago. What do you think might happen in this space in the next 5 or 10 years? What would you hope to see? How would you hope to see this work being used and applied?
I'll go first. First, I was so humbled, I think, by the responses that we got when the moment this article went live, given the difficulty we had publishing it, like we said. There was such a big receptive audience. And so that was very affirming, like we believed in this article and we're happy that it got out there. So one of the immediate things that I can see happening is sort of a follow-up article prompted by these insightful questions you have posed. These questions are really good. So kudos to your students for posing these questions. And I would love it if one of them or more of them could write something either springing from what we did or counter statement. That would be awesome, right? And since you brought up the cultural sort of aspect of humor, maybe there's some things in the article that are American humor based that don't seem that good in Australian context. So that's a good thing that might happen if we could collaborate, right? We could contrast things that are funny here and not funny there, and what does that mean? But beyond that, we hope that people TechCom can relax, really, because like we showed in the article, there's some scholars that go back in the 70s that were talking about this. They just didn't get traction, but there's a long history, and we would like to see it being taken up, particularly given the genres, the multimedia affordances that we now have when it comes to delivering technical information.
Yeah, I also, like Josie, was tickled when I heard, she texted me, I think, and told me that you all were reading it, and I was just tickled to hear that, and it was, we had a lot of fun writing it. I am always trying to have fun writing.
Yeah, we did have fun writing.
And, if I'm not having fun, I'm not interested. And I just am constantly in my writing trying to keep myself interested. And so I will continue to try to play in my own writing, and Josie will, and I think other people will, and that will grow. But I could see a few terms getting picked up because I think they're useful, like hedonism or the gray genres. They're useful for describing what's happening, and they've been useful for me to think about. So interesting to see.
Yeah, that gray genres one is the one that's really stuck with me as something that I've been saying to people in the school and in the university, thinking about the kinds of documents we produce and circulate, and our goals in training the next generation of writers.
Exactly.
All right, so lucky last question. Can you give us a bit of a plug? What are you working on at the moment? What do we put in our calendars to count down towards? No pressure.
Nothing fun related except, I'll start with something fun related, which I thought was, I wanted to examine this notion of throwing shade, which you lived in the US, so you understand that, right? So it's an African American concept. You do? Okay, it's an African American concept.
No. I was going to say, it's not even that I'd lived in the US. It is a visible concept here.
Okay.
Yeah, we have all of that culture comes across, so Yeah,
Okay.
we know.
But I was so tickled to learn that it originates in African American concept, specifically in queer Black American culture. I think this country, the world, owes so much to queer Black culture. They have originated so many like cultural, lexicon, that. Anyway, so I started looking at this idea. I presented it on Meet at Seas about Merriam-Webster somebody published an article, is Merriam-Webster throwing shade at Donald Trump? And I started to look at I was following them on Twitter, and they would, whenever something would come out of the Trump White House, they would say something about it. And I wanted to start writing on I presented something on it. So, but it's still sitting somewhere. One of these days I'll revisit it and maybe change the object of, but I want to visit the idea that the dictionary is not, when we were growing up, a dictionary was this thing. Word is codified, right? Whereas Merriam-Webster, what it was doing was like a dictionary is a living thing that's responding to misuse in real time and in often humorous, funny ways. So that's something I would like to do at some point. And funny things, I referred to the article I did on the city of Cape Town, which I have followed up with an analysis of policy, the city's policy papers or something like that. That's come out of. I was revisiting the idea of the deficit model of risk communication, and the city of Cape Town seemed to have learned not to approach the residents of the city like they didn't know what was going on, but rather co-equal partners in preventing a water crisis similar to the one they faced in 2012. So was it 2016? Yeah. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. It's probably under review, and a few other things that I can't quite remember. Yeah.
I have a book coming out next year called Strangely Rhetorical, and it, in some similar, it's just really rooted in playful style, and but the term I'm using there is strangeness, and how do you make something different or interesting or funky or weird, and so that book is coming out next year, and then I've started another book project to think about how we will write in the apocalypse, in different kind of levels of the apocalypse. So like writing in the event, writing kind of post-apocalyptic scenarios, and then writing sort of in the hereafter. Or does writing happen after death? And we do have models for these sorts of things, like texting during crisis events, or
that's right.
Or the Diary of Anne Frank is an interesting model for writing in an apocalyptic moment. And so, how can we think about prepping? There's lots of TechCom prepping sorts of stuff, zombie manuals and stuff like that. But how can we think about writing for the future in different kinds of scenarios? And so that's sort of a different project that I have been working on for a few years, and now that the other one is on its way out, I can turn my attention to that one. So
awesome.
Cool.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you both so much for joining us and for these really insightful questions, these really insightful answers. Questions are good too.
Excellent questions. Yes.
Yeah.
I had to do some homework.
I really appreciate you giving so much of your time today, and for your generosity with our students. So thank you very much. Let me go ahead.